Picture the sun rising over the Nile, its golden light spilling across the vast stone courts of an ancient Egyptian temple. The air hums with the scent of incense and the low murmur of countless priests and attendants moving through their sacred duties. In the midst of this orchestrated chaos, a lone figure stands apart, their voice rising in a haunting melody that seems to weave through the very pillars. We hear this beautiful music, and we assume we understand their role, the temple singer, a bringer of harmony. But what if their job was far more than just beautiful music? What if the songs they sang were not merely for pleasure, but were, in fact, a form of potent, active magic? Today, we pull back the veil of time to uncover the real, hidden duties of the temple singers of Egypt, roles that place them at the very heart of maintaining cosmic order and ensuring the survival of their civilization. This isn't just a story about art, it's a story about power, responsibility, and a secret job description lost to the ages. Think about the last time a piece of music gave you chills, or made you feel a profound sense of peace. Now, amplify that feeling 1,000-fold and imagine it as a tangible force, a tool used to communicate with the gods, to protect the pharaoh, and to keep the universe itself in balance. This was the true weight carried by those voices echoing in the hallowed halls. Theirs was a reality where a single, perfectly executed hymn could mean the difference between a bountiful harvest and devastating famine, between a king's victory and his downfall. We are about to journey beyond the familiar image of musicians and into a world where sound was a sacred technology, where these singers were not just performers but essential operators in the spiritual mechanics of an empire. It's a discovery that redefines our understanding of ancient Egypt, moving us from observers of their art to witnesses of their most profound and practical rituals. So let's step into the shadows of the hypostyle hall and listen closely, for the secrets we are about to uncover are not just sung, they are encoded in the very fabric of their songs, waiting centuries for someone to truly hear them. To truly grasp the role of the temple singer, you first have to understand the world they operated within, a world where the air itself was thick with purpose. An Egyptian temple was not a quiet place of solitary reflection. It was a bustling, roaring engine of cosmic maintenance, a factory for the divine. The first thing that would strike you was the smell, the heavy, resinous clouds of myrrh and frankincense, smoke curling in purposeful patterns toward the ceiling, each scent chosen for its specific ability to please the gods and purify the space. Your eyes would be dazzled by the glint of gold and electrum, the vibrant painted reliefs on every wall depicting gods and pharaohs in eternal, perfect order. But above all, it was the soundscape that defined this environment, a constant, layered symphony of sacred noise. You would hear the rhythmic clapping and chanting of priests in procession, the lowing of sacrificial animals from an outer court, the rhythmic splash of holy water, and the incessant, percussive rattle of the sistrum, a sacred rattle used to ward off chaotic forces. This was not chaos. This was a carefully orchestrated acoustic environment. In the ancient Egyptian mind, the universe was born from a primordial sound, a vibration that brought matter into being. Because of this, sound was not merely entertainment or communication. It was a primary substance of creation itself, a tangible vibration that could affect reality on a fundamental level. It could heal or harm, protect or destroy, nourish the gods or repel the demons of chaos that endlessly threaten to swallow the sun and plunge the world into darkness. The correct words, spoken or sung with the correct melody and rhythm, were not a request to the gods. They were an activation of divine power, a tool to directly manipulate the fabric of existence. And into this charged, overwhelming atmosphere stepped the temple singers. They were not performers in the sense we think of today, waiting for an audience's applause. They were the highly trained technicians of this sacred sonic technology. Their voices were the most refined and potent instruments in the entire temple complex. When a singer raised a hymn to a deity, they were not just singing about the god. Through the magical principle of Heka, the power of the spoken word, they were effectively manifesting that god's presence, feeding them with the beauty and perfection of the sound, and channeling their power back into the world to keep the cosmic order of truth and balance intact. They were the vocal engineers of reality, using melody as their blueprint. A single wrong note or mispronounced lyric wasn't an artistic failure. It was a ritual catastrophe, potentially breaking the magical circuit and leaving the world vulnerable to the forces of disorder. Their job was one of immense pressure, requiring years of rigorous training to memorize hundreds of complex hymns and to master the precise vocal techniques that would make their offerings acceptable to the divine ear. They worked in a realm where a song was as vital as a loaf of bread for the god's altar, and a melody was as powerful as a wall around the city. So who were the individuals entrusted with this immense responsibility? The title temple singer might conjure an image of a simple musician, but in reality, these were among the most educated and well-connected figures in all of Egyptian society. This was not a role one simply auditioned for. It was a position often inherited by birthright, deeply embedded within the elite strata of the kingdom. Many, if not most, of these singers were women from powerful aristocratic families, and a significant number bore the prestigious title, Chantress of Ammon, or other major deities. These women were not secluded away. They were public figures of immense influence, often depicted in statues and tomb paintings alongside high priests and government officials, their status clear for all to see. Some were even royal princesses and queens who used their high-born status to serve the gods directly. Think of it less as a musical career and more as a crucial branch of the civil service, a state-sanctioned office that carried both immense privilege and profound duty. Their path to the temple was laid out from early childhood. A girl born into one of these families would begin her training almost as soon as she could speak, learning the complex hieroglyphic texts of hymns that were considered the operational manuals for interacting with the divine. This was a rigorous, academic education. She wouldn't just memorize melodies, she would learn the precise pronunciation, the specific cadences, and the exact rhythmic patterns that gave each hymn its power. This was esoteric knowledge, passed down through generations, and a mistake in its delivery was unthinkable. This training forged a direct, tangible link between the elite class and the divine world, solidifying the family's power while ensuring that the most critical rituals were performed by those with the purest lineage and the most thorough education. They occupied a specific, honored rung in the temple's intricate hierarchy. They were part of the Hemu Netcher, the servants of the god, a broad category of temple personnel that included everyone from the high priest down to the cleaners. But within that structure, the singer held a unique position. While a priest's role might be tied to a specific festival or a cycle of purification, the singer's function was constant, their voice a daily necessity for the god's sustenance. They were integral to the core liturgy, the daily ritual of awakening, clothing, and feeding the god's statue in the inner sanctum. Their song was the accompanying energy, the vibrational offering that made the entire ceremony efficacious. This was a lifetime appointment, a career that defined their identity and their legacy, often commemorated proudly in their own tombs so they could continue their sacred office for eternity. This multifaceted role meant a temple singer's day was never about a single performance. Their vocal work was a form of high-stakes ritual technology, a sacred toolkit with several distinct, equally vital applications. The first and most fundamental of these was the maintenance of Ma'at, the cosmic principle of truth, balance, and order. The ancient Egyptians saw the universe as a constant struggle between Ma'at and the forces of chaos, known as Isfet. Every sunrise was a victory for order, every successful harvest a testament to its stability. The temple singers' hymns were not just descriptions of this balance, they were active contributions to it. Each perfectly pitched note, each correctly enunciated syllable, was like a thread being woven into the fabric of reality, reinforcing it against unraveling. When they sang of the sun god Ra's triumphant journey across the sky, they weren't merely telling a story. They were using the power of Heke, the magic of the spoken word, to ensure his bark actually overcame the serpent of chaos, Apep, and rose again the next morning. Their voice was a necessary component of the cosmos itself. Beyond this grand, universal duty, they had a deeply political and practical function, the protection of the pharaoh. The pharaoh was the living embodiment of Ma'at on Earth, the linchpin holding the entire system together. Any threat to him was a threat to the cosmos. Temple singers were part of the spiritual defense grid. Specialized hymns, often performed during state ceremonies or in temples dedicated to royal power, were designed to create a protective aura around the king. These were sonic shields, warding off malevolent magic, curses, and even physical insurrection by affirming the pharaoh's divine right and strengthening his connection to the gods. It was a form of national security conducted through melody. Finally, and most intimately, their role was that of a divine interlocutor, a direct line of communication with the gods. Inside the temple's most sacred chamber, the naos, where the statue of the deity resided, the atmosphere was believed to be thick with divine presence. The singer's role during the daily offering ritual was to bridge the gap between the human and the divine. Their voice, raised in a hymn of praise, was the vibrational offering that accompanied the physical offerings of food, drink, and incense. They weren't singing to the god from a distance. They were using their art to create a resonant field that allowed the god's essence to manifest more fully in the statue, to hear the prayers more clearly, and to be nourished by the beauty of the sound itself. In this context, the singer was a conduit, their lungs and vocal cords serving as instruments for divine energy to flow into the world. So, when we piece together this divine job description, we see a role that defies simple categorization. They were priest-magicians, performing sacred rites that manipulated cosmic forces. They were civil servants, upholding the state's stability through their spiritual work. And they were master technicians, wielding a sophisticated vocal technology that was as essential to Egypt's survival as the waters of the Nile. This entire system of cosmic maintenance and divine communication rested upon one foundational, all-pervading principle: the concept of Heka. To understand the temple singer is to understand Heka, for they were its master practitioners. Heka wasn't a dark, secretive sorcery practiced in shadows. It was, in the Egyptian worldview, a natural and fundamental force, as real and present as gravity. It was the very substance of magic, the power that brought the universe into being, and the energy that sustained it. The Egyptians believed that before creation, there was only a silent, dark, watery chaos. The first god, by speaking a word by producing a sound, activated Heka, and set the process of creation in motion. This means that sound and creative, magical power were intrinsically linked from the very beginning of time. Because of this origin story, correctly spoken or sung words were not just symbols or descriptions. They were considered vessels of this same creative energy. They were a tangible force, capable of shaping reality. For the temple singer, this transformed every performance from a simple act of entertainment into a potent, high-stakes ritual. Their voice was not just an instrument of beauty. It was a tool, a precision device calibrated to enact Heka. A hymn sung in the temple wasn't a story about the gods. It was an event that involved the gods directly. The vibrations of their voice, when paired with the correct, immutable words from a sacred text, were believed to manifest the reality described in the hymn. When a singer chanted a text about the sun god Ra defeating the serpent Apep, they weren't commemorating a past victory or hoping for a future one. Through the power of Heka, their vocalization was actively participating in that battle, lending their energy to ensure Ra's triumph and the sun's rebirth at dawn. This is why the training was so rigorous and the consequences of error so severe. A mispronunciation wasn't a simple mistake. It was like a surgeon's hand slipping during a delicate operation. It could create a flaw in the magical working, potentially rendering the ritual ineffective or, worse, producing an unintended and dangerous outcome. The singer's role was to be a flawless conduit, allowing the pure, unimpeded flow of Heka from the sacred texts into the world. This principle applied to every aspect of their duties. A healing chant was effective not because of suggestion, but because the sound vibrations, charged with Heka, were believed to physically realign the body's spiritual and physical components, driving out disease. A protective hymn sung for the pharaoh created an actual, energetic barrier around him, deflecting malicious forces. In this context, the temple singer becomes something far greater than a musician. They are a technician of the unseen, an architect of cosmic order, using the blueprint of sacred song to build and maintain reality itself. Their art was their science, and their stage was the entire universe. With the rising sun still a promise on the eastern horizon, the temple singer would begin her most vital and routine task. The entire cosmos hinged on this single, daily performance deep within the temple's most forbidden space. She would undergo a series of rigorous purifications, washing in sacred water and cleansing her mouth with natron salt, ensuring her body was a pristine vessel for the sacred sounds to come. Dressed in the finest white linen, she would then proceed through the temple's progressively darker and more restricted halls, moving from the open, sunlit courts into the shadowy hypostyle hall, and finally approaching the heart of the entire complex, the naos, the windowless shrine housing the cult statue of the god. This was not a public event. It was a clandestine, intimate encounter between the human and the divine, with the singer acting as the crucial intermediary. The air in this inner sanctum was heavy, thick with the lingering scent of yesterday's incense and the palpable feeling of a slumbering, immense power. The god, in the form of a statue made of precious wood, gold, and inlaid stones, was believed to be in a dormant, night-like state. The singer's job was nothing less than to use her voice to reignite the divine spark within the statue, to call the god's conscious presence back into the world for another day. The hymn she sang was not a gentle lullaby in reverse. It was a powerful, structured incantation, a vocal key designed to unlock the god's awareness. We are fortunate to have the actual texts of these morning hymns preserved on papyri and temple walls. They followed a specific, potent formula. The lyrics were not humble requests, but assertive, poetic declarations of the god's own attributes and mighty deeds. A hymn to the god Amun-Ra might begin with lines like, "Awaken peace, great God, you who rose from the primordial waters. You are the one who illuminates the two lands with your rays." This wasn't flattery. It was a strategic act of reminding the deity of its own nature and power, coaxing its essence back into the statue through the vibrational resonance of the words themselves. The singer was, in effect, holding up an acoustic mirror to the god, reflecting its own divine glory back at it, compelling it to manifest. Each line of the hymn was a carefully placed piece of a magical operation. The rhythm was deliberate, the melody likely designed to rise in pitch and intensity, mimicking the sun's ascent. As her voice filled the small, enclosed chamber, the sound waves would physically vibrate against the statue, the gold and wood acting as a resonator. In the Egyptian understanding of Heka, this wasn't just a symbolic gesture. The sound was physically interacting with the divine essence, stirring it from its rest. The perfect pronunciation of each hieroglyphic word was essential, as a single misstep could break the spell, leaving the god lethargic and unresponsive. A successful performance meant the god's Ka, its vital life force, was now fully present and active within the statue, ready to receive the day's offerings of food, drink, and clothing that would follow. The entire daily liturgy, and by extension the stability of the world, depended entirely on this initial, flawless vocal activation. It was a responsibility of almost unimaginable weight, performed in near-total darkness, with no audience but the god itself. But how exactly does a song become a meal for a god? The ancient Egyptians possessed a sophisticated, albeit non-scientific, understanding of energy transfer. They perceived the universe as being composed of different, interpenetrating layers of reality. The physical world we see and touch was just one facet. Coexisting with it was a vibrant spiritual dimension, the realm of the Netjeru, the gods. For the universe to function, energy had to flow between these realms. The gods provided the blueprint for existence, the laws of nature, the cycle of the Nile, the journey of the sun, but they required energy from the human world to enact and maintain that blueprint. This is where the concept of the Ka becomes essential. Every person and every god had a Ka, a kind of vital spark or life force double. Think of it not as a soul in the traditional sense, but as the very energy of life itself, an entity that needed constant replenishment. A god's Ka was colossal, requiring a massive and continuous influx of energy to perform its cosmic duties. Physical offerings, the bread, beer, meat, and incense presented on altars, were not consumed in a literal, physical sense. The Egyptians understood that the statue of the god did not get up and eat the food. Instead, the essence, the spiritual energy, the cow, the plural of ka, of the offerings, was what the deity absorbed. The smell of roasted meat, the sight of fresh bread, the smoke of fragrant incense, these were the vaporous, energetic components that nourished the divine ka. Now, apply this same principle to sound. The human voice, when trained to perfection and projected with focused intent, was considered one of the most potent carriers of this life force energy. A beautifully sung hymn was not just a sequence of pleasant notes. It was a dense, structured emission of vibrational energy, a direct transfusion of vitality from the human realm to the divine. The perfect pitch was crucial because it created a pure, stable frequency, like a clear radio signal that the god's ka could lock onto without static or interference. The flawless pronunciation of the ancient, powerful words ensured the message, or the specific type of energy being sent, was correctly formatted and understood. A hymn to Hathor, the goddess of joy and love, sung with a warm, resonant tone, would generate and transmit that specific quality of joyful energy directly to her, strengthening her ability to manifest those feelings in the world. In this context, the temple singer was far more than a performer. She was a master chef in the cosmic kitchen, preparing and serving the most refined spiritual cuisine. Her vocal cords were the instruments that transformed human breath, the very symbol of life, into a divine feast. When she sang, she was quite literally feeding the god's ka with the vibrational essence of the song, providing it with the strength it needed to continue its work. This explains the immense pressure for perfection. A poorly sung hymn, with flat notes or mumbled words, would be the equivalent of serving a god a meal that was spoiled, tasteless, or nutritionally void. It was an offering that failed to nourish, leaving the deity weakened and, by extension, jeopardizing the specific aspect of the cosmos it governed. A weakened Ra might lead to a dimmer sun or a failed harvest. A malnourished Osiris could disrupt the cycle of death and rebirth. The singer's daily ritual was therefore a continuous act of cosmic refueling, a vital link in a chain of energy that stretched from the human throat to the throne of the sun. Beyond the profound duty of awakening and nourishing the gods, the temple singer's role extended directly into the political and military security of the nation itself, with their voice becoming a strategic asset for the protection of the pharaoh. The king was far more than a political ruler. He was the living incarnation of the god Horus, the earthly anchor for the entire cosmic order of Maat. An attack on his person, whether through physical assassination, dark magic, or spiritual corruption, was an attack on reality itself, an event that could plunge Egypt back into the primordial chaos from which it emerged. Because of this, his protection was a matter of the highest priority, and the temple singers were deployed as his frontline spiritual defense. They were, in effect, his sonic bodyguards. Imagine a hostile foreign power sending sorcerers to weave a curse against the Egyptian king, or a disgruntled noble conspiring with a rogue priest to invoke a demon. Against these invisible, intangible threats, a physical army was useless. You couldn't fight a spell with a spear. The countermeasure was a more potent, more perfectly executed form of magic, and this is where the singer's trained voice became a weapon. Specialized hymns known as apotropaic, or protective chants, were their arsenal. These weren't gentle lullabies, they were aggressive, declarative sonic fortifications. The lyrics often took the form of powerful assertions of the pharaoh's divine nature and his inevitable triumph over all foes. A singer might chant, "The son of Ra is a blazing fire. His roar terrifies the nine bows," a term for all of Egypt's foreign enemies. No evil can approach his majesty, for he is surrounded by the roar of his father Ammon. These words weren't poetic metaphor in our modern sense. Through the principle of Heka, the act of singing them aloud was believed to manifest that very reality. The sound vibrations created an energetic barrier, a resonant field around the pharaoh that would deflect malevolent spells and repel chaotic spirits. Think of it as a form of spiritual noise cancellation, where the perfectly pitched, sacred frequencies of the hymn actively jammed the discordant, chaotic frequencies of a curse. This protective role was most visible during major state ceremonies, particularly those dealing with the king's legitimacy and power. During the said festival, A jubilee celebrating the continued reign of a pharaoh. Specific choirs of temple singers would perform lengthy cycles of these protective hymns. Their collective voices would fill the ceremonial space, creating a sanctified acoustic environment where the king's ritual actions, his running a course to demonstrate his vitality, his reception of symbols of power were shielded from any spiritual interference. The success of the festival, and by extension the renewal of the king's divine mandate for another reign, was seen as dependent on this flawless sonic shielding. But this duty wasn't confined to grand ceremonies alone. It was an ongoing, background process. In temples dedicated to royal cults across Egypt, singers performed daily rites focused solely on the king's well-being. They sang hymns that constantly reaffirmed his connection to powerful, protective deities like Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of war and pestilence, or the Eye of Ra, a destructive force that could be directed against the king's enemies. By channeling these fierce divine energies through song, the singers maintained a perpetual, active defense system. Their voices were the constant hum of a spiritual power grid, ensuring the pharaoh, the single most important person in the universe from an Egyptian perspective, remained inviolable. This made them indispensable operatives in a form of national security that was as real to the ancient Egyptians as any border fortress or regiment of soldiers. A breach in their vocal performance was considered as catastrophic as a breach in the walls of a city, for it could leave the very heart of the kingdom spiritually exposed. Yet the influence of the temple singer was not confined to the sunlit world of the living. Their sacred expertise was considered just as vital for the final, most perilous journey a person would ever undertake, the voyage through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. When a wealthy or noble individual died, their family sought to provide them with every possible advantage for the trials ahead, and this often meant hiring a professional temple singer to perform at the tomb. This was not a eulogy in our modern sense, a simple memorial for the grieving. This was active, practical spiritual support, a vocal escort service into the afterlife. The Egyptians envisioned the Duat as a terrifying, labyrinthine realm filled with lakes of fire, gateways guarded by demonic beings wielding knives, and a series of judgment halls where the deceased's heart would be weighed against the feather of mat. To navigate this landscape and achieve eternal life, the soul needed two things: a detailed map and the correct passwords to get past the guardians. The temple singer's voice provided both. They were the masters of the funerary texts, the intricate guides we know today as the pyramid texts, coffin texts, and eventually the Book of the Dead. These were not books to be read silently. Their power was only activated when spoken or sung aloud with perfect ritual precision. A temple singer, standing before the sealed tomb or in the mortuary chapel, would perform these texts, her voice becoming a living, resonant version of the guidebook. When she sang of the field of reeds, the blissful paradise awaiting the justified dead, she wasn't just describing a hopeful destination. She was using Heka to help manifest a pathway toward it. Her melody gave form and substance to the spiritual geography, creating a sonic beacon for the disoriented soul to follow out of the darkness. More critically, her performance provided the essential passwords. The texts are filled with specific spells designed to be recited at specific obstacles. Spell for not dying a second time. Spell for passing by the dangerous gate, guarded by the one who swallows souls. The singer, with her flawless training, would vocalize these spells on behalf of the deceased. As she chanted the words, "Oh, fire embracer who came forth from the backwards walking demon, I know you, I know your name. Let me pass, for I am pure." It was believed her voice carried the authority and the magical charge needed to pacify the demon and force the gate to open. She was, in effect, a vocal locksmith, using the precise tonal keys of her song to unlock the doors of the afterlife for the one who had hired her services. This transformed the funeral from a somber farewell into a magically assisted launch sequence, where the singer's expertise was the rocket fuel propelling the soul through the initial, most hazardous stages of its journey. For the family members gathered, the sound of her confident, powerful voice was not just comforting. It was the audible proof that their loved one was being given the best possible chance at immortality, guided by a professional who spoke the language of the gods as a native tongue. Of course, the temple singer's voice was her primary instrument, but she was rarely, if ever, working alone. Her potent vocal magic was amplified and supported by a set of powerful, specialized tools, each designed to manipulate spiritual energies in a specific way. Think of her not as a soloist, but as the conductor of a small, sacred orchestra where every instrument had a distinct, non-negotiable purpose. The two most iconic of these were the sistrum and the menat, objects that might look like simple noisemakers to our modern eyes, but were, in the rituals of ancient Egypt, sophisticated devices for channeling divine power. These weren't accessories, they were extensions of the singer's own magical will, engineered to produce frequencies that her voice alone could not. The most famous of these was the sistrum, a ceremonial rattle with a distinctive looped frame. Its sound, a sharp, shimmering rustle of metal discs sliding across crossbars, is instantly recognizable in art and has even been recreated by modern musicians. But to reduce it to a mere time-keeping instrument would be like calling a surgeon's scalpel a simple knife. The sound of the sistrum was considered uniquely potent in the spiritual ecosystem of the temple, specifically calibrated to interact with the divine feminine. Its primary association was with the goddess Hathor, the deity of music, joy, love, and crucially, the furious rage of the Eye of Ra. The mythology stated that in her wrathful form, Hathor had once tried to destroy humanity. The only way the gods could calm her was through music and dance. The sistrum, shaken in a specific rhythmic pattern, was the tool created for this very purpose. Its sound was believed to be inherently soothing to her, a vibrational balm that could placate her anger and keep her in her benevolent, joyful aspect. So, when a temple singer shook a sistrum during a hymn to Hathor, she wasn't just keeping time. She was actively performing a delicate act of cosmic diplomacy, using sound to pacify a potentially world-ending force, and ensuring the goddess showered Egypt with her gifts of abundance and celebration. But its function went even further. The chaotic serpent Apep, the eternal enemy of the sun god Ra, was not just a physical beast, but a creature of pure disorder and noise, the antithesis of mad. The sharp, percussive, and highly structured sound of the sistrum was the acoustic weapon of choice against this formless chaos. Its clear, definable rattle was believed to cut through the murky, dissonant energy of Isfet, creating a bubble of sacred, ordered sound that repelled demons and purified the ritual space. Every shake was a declaration of order against entropy, a sonic sword strike in the eternal battle for cosmic balance. The instrument's very shape was symbolic, often topped with the face of Hathor or the cat-headed goddess Bastet, turning it into a portable idol whose power was activated by its sound. The temple singer, then, wielded the sistrum as both a shield and a shield against chaos and a key to unlocking the benevolent aspects of powerful, volatile goddesses. While the sistrum was an external tool held in the hand, the menat was an instrument that became part of the singer's very body. A menat was a heavy, multi-strand beaded necklace, often made of faience or precious stones like turquoise and carnelian, with a distinctive counterpoise, a heavy, decorated plaque that hung down the back. It was not typically worn as everyday jewelry. It was a ritual object, held in the hands and shaken to produce a deep, clacking, percussive sound entirely different from the sistrum's metallic shimmer. If the sistrum was a tool for cosmic defense and divine appeasement, the menat was an instrument of life-giving invocation. Its power was overwhelmingly associated with fertility, sexual vitality, and regeneration. The beads themselves, often shaped like fruit or fertility symbols, and the sheer weight of the piece connected it to ideas of abundance and physicality. When shaken, the menat was believed to generate a powerful, resonant field of Heke, specifically designed to invoke the presence and power of Hathor in her most nurturing, life-affirming role. The sound and the physical act of shaking it were a direct call for her to bestow her blessings of conception, safe childbirth, and robust health. It was a tool for ensuring the continuity of life, both for the royal family to produce heirs and for the land itself to remain fertile. But its function was also deeply protective. The menat was thought to be imbued with the protective, magical essence of the goddess. To hold it and shake it was to grasp a direct line to her power. In ritual processions or during healing ceremonies, the singer would shake the menat over a person, using its sound and its perceived energy to create a protective aura, to drive out sickness, which was seen as a form of spiritual chaos, and to restore the individual's vital force, their ka. This made the menet a tool of both creation and preservation, its deep, rhythmic clatter a heartbeat of life itself, amplifying the singer's hymns into potent spells for renewal and safeguarding. Together, the sistrum and the menet formed a complete sonic toolkit. The singer's voice provided the intentionality and the sacred words, the sistrum provided the high-frequency purification and divine appeasement, and the menet provided the low-frequency vibration of life and protection. They were the treble and bass of her magical arsenal. When she performed, voice, sistrum, and menet worked in concert, creating a complex, multi-layered sonic tapestry that was far more powerful than any single element could ever be alone. This synergistic effect was the true secret to her power. She was a one-woman generator of sacred frequency, using every tool at her disposal to shape reality, protect the kingdom, and nourish the gods, proving that in ancient Egypt, the most potent magic was a harmony of voice, instrument, and unwavering intent. Yet with all the power of their voices and the support of their sacred instruments, the temple singers' true mastery lay in an area we might easily overlook: the absolute, non-negotiable precision of their pronunciation. In our modern world, mispronouncing a foreign word might cause a moment of embarrassment, but for these ancient vocal technicians, a single misplaced syllable or a slightly off cadence wasn't a social faux pas, it was a potential ritual catastrophe. The language they were required to master was not the common Egyptian spoken in the streets and markets. It was an archaic, highly formalized dialect, preserved in hieroglyphic texts that were centuries, sometimes even millennia, old. These hymns were considered the direct words of the gods, revealed in a time of primordial perfection. Every consonant, every vowel length, every rhythmic pause was believed to be a divinely engineered component of a larger magical formula. To alter any part of it was to fundamentally change the formula's outcome, much like a chemist substituting one element for another in a volatile compound. The correct sequence of sounds created a specific, desired spiritual vibration. A flawed sequence could produce a completely different, and often dangerous, result. Imagine chanting a powerful spell designed to summon a protective deity, but because of a slight slip of the tongue, you accidentally invoke a demon of pestilence instead. This was the ever-present risk. The Egyptians believed that the original creative force, Heka, was activated and directed through the spoken word. The temple singer's role was to replicate those original, world-shaping sounds with perfect fidelity. Her voice was a tool for tuning the cosmos, and a single flat note in this divine orchestra didn't just sound bad. It introduced a note of chaos, of isfet, into a ritual that was supposed to be the epitome of order. This immense pressure transformed their role from mere performers into the most meticulous of scholars. They were the living librarians and keepers of sacred linguistic secrets, responsible for memorizing and reproducing phonetic sequences that may have lost all meaning in the common language centuries before. Their training was a relentless process of oral transmission, passing these sonic blueprints from master to student, with no room for personal interpretation or creative flair. They learned the precise guttural inflection for a hymn to the earth god Jeb, which was different from the light, airy tone required for a hymn to the sky goddess Nut. They practiced the exact sibilants needed to properly address the serpent goddess Wajet, a sound that had to convey both reverence and a subtle authority to avoid her wrath. This was not artistry, it was a high-stakes science of sound. Their value to the temple and the state was not just in the beauty of their voice, but in the flawless accuracy of their articulation. They were the guardians of a sonic tradition that was as critical to the nation's survival as the annual flooding of the Nile. A successful harvest, the pharaoh's health, the very rising of the sun, all of it could theoretically be compromised by a single mispronounced word during a key ritual. This burden of perfection meant that a temple singer's entire life was one of disciplined focus, where every breath taken in the inner sanctum was measured, and every sound that passed her lips carried the weight of the world. Now, consider this constant struggle on the grandest possible scale, where the temple singers were deployed as the first line of defense. Every single day, the sun god Ra embarked on his journey across the sky in his solar bark, a voyage that was not a foregone conclusion, but a perilous battle through the 12 regions of the night. His chief adversary was the monstrous serpent Apep, the living embodiment of Isfet, a being of pure, formless chaos who sought to devour the sun and plunge the world into eternal darkness. The priests had their own physical rituals to aid Ra, such as burning wax models of the serpent and reciting curses, but the temple singers provided the essential vibrational support. During key moments of the day, particularly at dawn and dusk when the barrier between worlds was thinnest, they would perform specific hymns known as songs to repel Apep. These were not gentle pleas but aggressive, forceful incantations. As they sang, their voices, often accompanied by the aggressive shaking of the sistrum to create a sound that cut through chaos, were believed to physically bind the serpent, sapping its strength and allowing Ra's bark to slip past unharmed. A successful performance meant sunrise. A failure in the ritual, a flaw in the song, could theoretically lead to an eclipse, a storm, or even an unending night. Their harmony was quite literally the sound of the world continuing to exist. This cosmic battle also had direct, tangible consequences on Earth. The principles of Ma'at governed everything, from the flooding of the Nile to the fertility of the soil and the stability of the social order. Isfet manifested as drought, plague, foreign invasion, and civil unrest. The temple singer's role was to create a pervasive atmosphere of harmony that actively suppressed these chaotic manifestations. Think of their daily performances throughout the temple complex as a form of continuous, spiritual air conditioning, cooling and calming a world constantly threatening to overheat with disorder. If a plague was rumored to be approaching a city, the singers would intensify their rituals, focusing on hymns to protective deities like Sekhmet, their voices creating a sonic quarantine, a barrier of ordered sound that disease-carrying demons of chaos could not cross. In times of potential famine, their songs would be directed toward gods like Osiris and Hapi, the god of the Nile inundation, their harmonious melodies acting as a vibrational offering to encourage the river's rise and the land's renewal. They were the technicians maintaining the spiritual infrastructure that kept society functioning, their voices the steady hum of a cosmic generator powering the machinery of civilization. This makes their role not merely religious, but profoundly practical. The pharaoh and his armies could fight tangible human enemies, but against the abstract, all-pervading threat of Isfet, the most effective weapon was harmonious sound. The temple singer, therefore, was a soldier in this unseen war, her voice her sword and her shield. While a general won battles on the frontier, she fought the war on the home front, in the sacred space, ensuring that the very fabric of reality remained intact. Her victory was not marked by captured prisoners or conquered lands, but by the simple, profound fact of the sun rising each morning, the river flooding its banks each year, and the kingdom enduring in peace and prosperity. In the grand, eternal conflict between order and chaos, her song was the decisive factor. This immense responsibility for cosmic order meant that not all sacred music was considered suitable for public performance or even for every temple singer. The most potent hymns, the ones that dealt directly with the core mechanics of creation or the most dangerous divine forces, were treated as classified state secrets, a form of restricted theological technology accessible only to the most senior and trusted initiates. You can think of the temple's musical traditions as having multiple layers of clearance. A junior singer might master the hymns for daily offerings and public festivals, but the truly transformative, universe-altering compositions were locked away, passed down orally in absolute secrecy from one generation of masters to the next. This wasn't about elitism for its own sake, it was a necessary safety protocol. The Egyptians believed that wielding this level of sonic power required not just technical skill, but profound spiritual maturity and a lifetime of disciplined practice. An unprepared individual, even with perfect pitch, attempting to vocalize these sequences could inadvertently unleash forces they couldn't control, causing spiritual backlash, divine offense, or catastrophic magical misfires. The most dangerous hymns were those associated with the act of creation itself. texts that recited the names and attributes of the gods in the precise order they emerged from the primordial waters of Nun. To sing these was to momentarily reenact that first, explosive moment of Genesis, and doing so carelessly was like handing a nuclear reactor's control panel to an untrained child. The risks were simply too great. Therefore, access to this secret knowledge was a mark of the highest rank and trust within the temple hierarchy. A singer who was finally taught these hidden hymns had reached the pinnacle of their profession, becoming a true master of Heka, a living repository of the most powerful sounds in the known universe. Their performances were often conducted in the deepest, most secure parts of the temple, away from all other personnel, with only the god as their witness. The air in those chambers must have crackled with palpable intensity, thick with the concentration of the singer and the immense power she was channeling through her voice, a solitary figure holding the blueprint of reality in her memory and the force of creation in her lungs. To understand why this secrecy was so vital, we need to look at specific examples of hymns and decode their hidden, multi-layered meanings. On the surface, many Egyptian hymns read like beautiful, flowery poetry, praising a god's strength, radiance, or benevolence. But to the initiated singer, every epithet, every metaphor, was a carefully coded instruction for a specific magical operation. Let's take a famous example from a hymn to the god Osiris, the Lord of the Dead and Resurrection. A line might read, "Hail to you, Osiris, Lord of Eternity, King of the Living, whose being is woven from the stars and the earth." To a layperson, this is a majestic title. But to the trained singer, this was a complex set of magical commands. The phrase, Lord of Eternity, wasn't just a compliment, it was an invocation of Osiris's specific aspect as the god who transcends linear time. By singing these words with the correct intonation, the singer was tapping into that timeless quality, attempting to pull the deceased soul out of the cycle of decay and into eternal life. King of the Living is a profound paradox, as Osiris is a dead god. This phrase was a key theological assertion that true life exists beyond physical death, and by vocalizing it, the singer was magically affirming this reality for the soul she was guiding. Most crucially, whose being is woven from the stars and the earth, is a direct reference to the Egyptian belief that the imperishable stars were the souls of the blessed dead, and the earth was the body of Osiris. Singing this line was an act of sympathetic magic, weaving the deceased soul into that very cosmic tapestry, stitching their essence into the fabric of the heavens and the underworld simultaneously. The surface praise concealed a deep, operative spell for soul transformation. Another potent example comes from hymns dedicated to the goddess Sekhmet, the terrifying lioness deity of plague, war, and healing. A typical line might be, Sekhmet the powerful, whose breath is the scorching desert wind, whose roar brings silence to the rebellious. On its face, this describes a fierce and frightening goddess. But the hidden meaning is a manual for directing her destructive energy. For a priest-doctor trying to cure a patient, a precisely sung hymn to Sekhmet wasn't a plea for her to go away. It was a sophisticated act of spiritual direction. The singer, through the specific cadence and forcefulness of her delivery, was attempting to channel Sekhmet's scorching breath toward the demons of disease inhabiting the patient's body, using her vocalized Heka to guide that destructive force to burn away the sickness without harming the person. Conversely, in a time of war, the same hymn would be sung with a different, more aggressive intention. The phrase, "whose roar brings silence to the rebellious," became a battle spell. As the singer projected these words, she was focusing Sekhmet's fury like a laser onto the armies of Egypt's enemies, her voice becoming the symbolic roar that would magically paralyze their forces with fear and confusion, creating silence on the battlefield by ensuring their defeat. The same sequence of words, depending on the ritual context and the singer's trained intent, could either heal or destroy. This is why the secret knowledge was so crucial. A novice might see a hymn to Sekhmet and simply sing it with generic power, potentially unleashing her undirected wrath indiscriminately. A master singer understood the nuanced controls, the subtle shifts in volume, pitch, and rhythm that would make the hymn a precise surgical tool instead of a blunt weapon. She knew which syllables to emphasize to invoke Sekhmet's healing aspect, and which to soften to temper her rage. This was the real, hidden art, not just knowing the words, but understanding the vibrational dials and switches embedded within them, allowing her to fine-tune the flow of divine power for a specific, desired outcome. This esoteric knowledge transformed her from a vocalist into a virtuoso conductor of cosmic forces. If we listen only to the voice, we are missing half of the performance, and with it, a fundamental dimension of the magic. The temple singer was a complete physical instrument, and her role frequently demanded that her entire body be engaged in a sacred, choreographed dance. This was not an optional flourish or a simple expression of joy. It was a deliberate, prescribed form of sacred geometry, a way of physically mapping the rhythms of the cosmos and actively directing spiritual energy through space. While her voice manipulated the vibrational fabric of reality, her movements carved that same reality into the air around her, tracing the patterns of the gods with her feet and hands. Her dance was a form of kinetic heka, as potent and intentional as the words she sang. In many temple reliefs, we see these musicians depicted not as static figures but in motion, their feet lifted, their arms raised in specific, graceful gestures. These poses were not artistic conventions, they were frozen moments of a sophisticated ritual technology. Each step, each turn, each placement of the hands was a hieroglyph written in the air, a component of a larger, living spell. The dance floor itself became a symbolic representation of the universe. The singer might begin a sequence by moving from the west to the east, physically reenacting the sun's journey. A circular dance could represent the cyclical nature of time or the protective, enclosing power of a goddess like Isis. When she stretched her arms toward the heavens, she was creating a physical conduit between the earth and the sky, channeling the power of the god down into the temple. When she stamped her foot rhythmically on the stone floor, she was grounding that power, anchoring it into the world and driving away the formless forces of chaos that had no defined shape or rhythm. The sistrum in her right hand and the menet necklace shaken in her left were not just heard. Their sounds were physically woven into the space by her movements, creating a three-dimensional web of sacred noise that enveloped the ritual and everyone in it. Her dance was a way of drawing a protective circle, a mobile sanctuary of ordered sound and movement that kept the chaotic whispers of Isfet at bay. This physical embodiment of divine principles was especially critical in rituals involving specific deities. In ceremonies for Hathor, the goddess of music, ecstasy, and fertility, the dances were often more fluid and celebratory, designed to invoke her joyful and life-giving aspects. The movements would be sweeping and graceful, mimicking the flow of the Nile or the swaying of papyrus reeds, all intended to attract her benevolent gaze and encourage her blessings of abundance. In stark contrast, a ritual for the warrior goddess Sekhmet would involve a much more aggressive and forceful style of movement. The dance might feature sharp, angular gestures, fierce stomping, and mimed actions of shooting arrows or wielding a sword. This was not a symbolic portrayal of battle, it was an active participation in it. The singer-dancer was, through her choreography, embodying Sekhmet's fury, directing it against the enemies of Egypt or the demons of disease, becoming a living vessel for the goddess's destructive power and focusing it with terrifying precision. This practice of embodying a deity through movement reveals the ultimate purpose of this sacred dance. The temple singer's goal was often to achieve a state of ritual possession, where the boundary between herself and the god she served would temporarily dissolve. The combination of the hypnotic rhythm, the repetitive, powerful lyrics, and the precise, exhausting movements could induce a trance state. In this elevated condition, she was no longer merely a woman performing a rite, she was a theophany, a temporary incarnation of the divine. Her voice became the god's voice, her movements became the god's actions. When she sang a healing chant in this state, it was the goddess herself speaking. When she performed a protective dance around the pharaoh, it was the god's own power circling him. This total physical and spiritual commitment underscores the incredible demands of her profession. A temple singer was an athlete of the spirit, required to possess the lung capacity of an opera singer, the memorization skills of a scholar, and the physical endurance of a dancer, all while maintaining an unbreakable focus of will. A single misstep in the dance could be as magically disruptive as a mispronounced word, breaking the geometric pattern and creating a flaw in the ritual's energetic matrix. Her performance was a total work of art, a symphony of sound and motion where every element was interdependent, and perfection in all aspects was the only acceptable standard. All this immense spiritual and political responsibility came with a very tangible, earthly reward, placing the temple singers among the most affluent and economically secure members of ancient Egyptian society. While their voices served the gods, their profession also served to build substantial personal fortunes, transforming their sacred office into a powerful economic engine for both themselves and the temple institutions they served. We must set aside any modern notion of a struggling artist. A chantress of Ammon was a wealthy individual, compensated not with a simple wage, but with a direct share of the divine abundance that flowed through the temple. The primary form of this compensation was a regular allotment from the temple's vast storerooms, which were constantly replenished by royal grants and the tithes of an entire nation. Imagine the daily distribution after the morning rituals were complete. A singer would receive her portion of the very offerings that had just been presented to the god, prime cuts of beef and goose from the altars, loaves of the finest white bread, jugs of beer and wine, and bundles of high-quality linen. This was not merely sustenance, it was a portion of sanctified goods, imbued with divine favor, and it was also the backbone of a robust domestic economy. A single singer might receive enough food to feed her entire extended family and household staff, with a significant surplus left over. This surplus could then be traded or sold in the bustling markets outside the temple walls. That linen, woven for a god, was the most desirable and expensive textile available. That beer and bread, though spiritually consumed by the deity, remained physically intact and became a valuable commodity. Through this system, the temple singer became a key node in a redistributive economic network, converting divine offerings into secular wealth and circulating temple resources back into the broader economy. Beyond these daily rations, the most successful singers accumulated capital in the form of land and servants, the ultimate markers of wealth in the ancient world. We have numerous legal documents and tomb inscriptions that record chantresses of Ammon owning vast agricultural estates, complete with the livestock and personnel to work them. These weren't just small gardens, they were productive farms that generated income from grain, fruit, and cattle. How did they acquire such holdings? Often it was through direct royal reward. A pharaoh, grateful for the spiritual support during a successful military campaign or a long and prosperous reign, might grant a parcel of state-owned land to a prominent singer or her entire choir. In other cases, their accumulated wealth from offering shares allowed them to purchase land outright. This land ownership fundamentally altered their social standing. They were not just employees of the temple, they were landowners and employers themselves, wielding significant economic influence. The same texts reveal that these women also owned slaves, individuals who worked their estates or served in their households. While the modern connotation of slavery is harsh in the Egyptian context, it was a recognized form of labor, and owning slaves was a clear indicator of high socioeconomic status. It meant the singer had the means to support a large, non-productive household, freeing her to focus entirely on her demanding ritual duties. This accumulation of tangible assets, food, linen, land, and labor transformed the role from a spiritual calling into a dynastic profession. A mother who was a chantress could pass her position, her land, and her wealth to her daughter, creating powerful, intergenerational priestly families whose influence was rooted as much in economic power as it was in religious authority. Their tombs, often lavishly decorated and stocked with grave goods, stand as permanent testaments to this wealth, proving that their service to the gods provided a very comfortable journey into the afterlife as well. This system of generous compensation was not a case of the temple being overly generous. It was a calculated and essential investment in cosmic stability. Think of the temple administration as the board of directors for the most critical corporation in Egypt, the maintenance of the universe. The singers were their top-tier engineers, operating the delicate machinery of creation. Paying them well was a strategic necessity. Ensuring their economic security guaranteed their complete and undivided loyalty. A singer worried about feeding her family or losing her social standing might be distracted during a crucial ritual. And as we've seen, a distraction could lead to a mispronounced hymn, a flawed ritual, and potential cosmic consequences. By making them wealthy, the state and the temple insulated them from worldly concerns, allowing them to focus entirely on the perfection of their sacred craft. Furthermore, this wealth was a direct reflection of their perceived value. The sheer quantity of offerings they received was a measure of how highly the institution prized their unique, irreplaceable skills. It was a tangible acknowledgement that their voices were as vital to the nation's well-being as the work of generals, architects, or treasury officials. This economic model also had a profound feedback effect on the temple's own economy. The vast offerings given to the gods, and then redistributed to the staff, required a constant inflow of resources. This demand stimulated agriculture, linen production, and brewing industries across Egypt. The temple singers, by consuming and trading their shares, were active participants in a thriving economic cycle that they, through their rituals, were also magically ensuring would continue. Their role completed a powerful circle. Their songs encouraged the Nile to flood. The floods produced the grain became temple offerings, and the offerings funded the singers who would sing the songs to begin the process anew. They were both beneficiaries and guardians of the entire system. Their personal prosperity inextricably linked to the prosperity of the kingdom they worked tirelessly to protect. This deep integration into the divine and economic fabric of Egypt naturally positioned temple singers as powerful, albeit subtle, political influencers. Their voices served as a critical tool of statecraft, weaving the pharaoh's earthly authority directly into the sacred soundscape of the nation. Every hymn performed in a public festival or during a state procession was a carefully crafted piece of political communication, designed not just to honor a god, but to broadcast a very specific message to the people. This king rules because the gods themselves have decreed it. Imagine a massive public celebration for the Apet festival, where the statue of Ammon was carried in a grand procession from Karnak to Luxor Temple. As the golden bark of the god moved through the streets, flanked by soldiers and priests, a choir of the most prestigious temple singers would be chanting hymns that explicitly linked the reigning pharaoh to Ammon. They wouldn't just sing, "Hail to Ammon, king of the gods." They would sing, "Hail to Ammon, father of the mighty pharaoh, the beloved son who acts upon his command on earth." This was divine public relations, a sonic reinforcement of the political theology that the pharaoh was the literal offspring of the supreme deity. For the average Egyptian listening in the crowd, this wasn't propaganda in the modern, cynical sense. It was a reaffirmation of a fundamental truth, delivered by the most trusted spiritual authorities in the land. The singers gave a divine voice to the state's ideology, making resistance to the pharaoh seem not just treasonous, but sacrilegious, a direct rebellion against the cosmic order they worked so hard to maintain. Their role became even more overt and crucial during periods of potential instability, such as the ascension of a new and perhaps untested pharaoh. A new king needed to quickly cement his legitimacy in the eyes of both the elite and the populace. A key part of this campaign was the composition and performance of special coronation hymns, which were essentially the ancient equivalent of a modern inaugural address, but with the added power of Heka. These hymns, sung by the most influential chantresses in the most prominent temples, would narrate the new pharaoh's divine birth and his selection by the gods to rule. The singer's voice, charged with magical authority, was believed to help manifest this reality, magically binding the people's acceptance and the gods' favor to the new ruler. A successful coronation hymn performance was a vital step in securing a peaceful and stable transition of power, making these singers indispensable partners in the political process. Their influence, therefore, extended far beyond the temple walls, reaching directly into the hearts and minds of every citizen who heard their state-sanctioned melodies. They were the amplifiers of royal power, using the sacred medium of song to ensure that the will of the palace became the accepted truth of the people. But perhaps the most intimate and immediate application of their power was in the realm of healing. where the temple singer's voice transitioned from a tool of cosmic maintenance to a direct instrument of medicine. In the world of ancient Egypt, illness was rarely seen as a purely biological event. A fever, a wound that wouldn't heal, or a sudden paralysis was often diagnosed as an invasion by a malevolent spirit, the venomous bite of a ghost, or the direct consequence of a moral failing that had upset the balance of Ma'at within a person's body. The physical symptom was merely the outward sign of a deep spiritual crisis. Combating this required a two-pronged approach, and the temple singer was one half of a formidable medical team. While the physician, the SWNW, would employ practical, earthly remedies stitching wounds, setting bones with splints, and prescribing herbal concoctions from a vast pharmacopoeia, the singer addressed the underlying spiritual cause. Her voice was the scalpel for the soul. She would be summoned to the bedside, not as a comforting presence, but as a specialized technician. Her task was to use specific, potent chants to drive out the invasive spirit causing the affliction, to repair the cracks in the individual's spiritual armor, and to restore the natural, healthy flow of their life force, their ka. These healing chants were precise medical prescriptions in their own right. We have examples preserved on medical papyri, where a recipe for a poultice made of honey and acacia leaves is immediately followed by the exact words of a spell, to be spoken or sung over the medicine as it was applied. The two were inseparable. The physical remedy treated the body, while the sung spell activated the medicine's spiritual potency and directly attacked the disease entity. A chant for a burn, for instance, might invoke the coolness of the Nile water and the goddess Isis, who famously used her magic to heal her son Horus. As the singer vocalized these words, she wasn't just describing coolness. She was channeling the very essence of it, using the vibrational quality of her voice to bring a soothing, restorative energy to the seared flesh. The effectiveness of the treatment was believed to depend entirely on the flawless execution of both components, the correct herb and the correctly sung spell. This collaboration reveals a sophisticated, holistic view of health, where body and spirit were treated as an interconnected system, and the healer needed to be a master of both worlds. The specific techniques they employed were as varied as the ailments they treated. For a patient suffering from a fever, believed to be caused by a fiery demon, the singer might adopt a soft, cooling, and repetitive melody. The goal was to create a sonic environment that was utterly inhospitable to the heat-based entity, a vibrational blanket of coolness that would coax it to leave. She might gently shake a Menet necklace over the patient, its deep, clacking rhythm intended to ground their overheated ka and restore stability. In stark contrast, dealing with a sickness attributed to a powerful, stubborn demon required a completely different vocal approach. Here, the singer's voice would become a weapon. The chant would be loud, aggressive, and declarative. She would likely stand over the patient, projecting her voice with force, directly commanding the spirit to depart. The lyrics would often take the form of a legalistic argument or a display of superior divine authority. She might sing, "I am the daughter of Ra. My voice is the lasso of Sekhmet. I bind you, spirit of pain. I command you to flee to the desert wastes where you belong. You have no power here, for I speak with the tongue of Hathor." This wasn't a request. It was an eviction notice, delivered with the full weight of her magical training. The sound itself, sharp and percussive, was believed to physically discomfort the non-corporeal entity, much like an unbearably bright light would hurt human eyes. In cases of psychological distress, or what we might now call depression or anxiety, seen as a corruption of the heart or mind, the singer's role was to cleanse and recalibrate. Her chant would be a melodic, soothing purification, a vocal washing that sought to rinse away the spiritual contamination and realign the person's inner being with the harmonious frequencies of Ma'at. She might use a sistrum here not for its aggressive, chaotic, repelling properties, but for its clear, shimmering tone, which was thought to clear psychic static and bring clarity to a troubled mind. The true skill of the healing singer, therefore, lay in her diagnostic ability. She had to assess the spiritual nature of the sickness and then select the precise vocal tone, volume, rhythm, and lyrical content that would serve as the perfect counter-frequency, the exact antidote of sound to neutralize the specific poison afflicting the patient. Her voice was a versatile medical instrument, capable of delivering everything from a gentle, vibrational balm to a focused, spiritual surgery. So far, we've seen these singers as master technicians of sound, political influencers, and cosmic engineers. But this portrait raises a fascinating question. Was this a uniquely female sphere of influence? While male singers certainly existed and held their own titles, the evidence from tombs, temples, and administrative records overwhelmingly points to a world where women, particularly women of high birth, not only dominated this profession, but leveraged it to become some of the most publicly powerful and visible women in all of ancient Egypt. The role of a temple singer, or more specifically a chantress, was one of the few prestigious, high-status careers open to women that operated in the public, institutional sphere, rather than being confined to the private household. For an elite woman, it was a pathway to personal wealth, social independence, and a form of authority that was recognized and respected across the kingdom. We see this most clearly in the prestigious title, Chief of the Musical Troupe of Ammon, a position held by women of the highest nobility and even by royal princesses. This wasn't just a fancy name for a choir director. Think of the Temple of Ammon at Karnak as the Vatican of its day, a sprawling, unbelievably wealthy institution that was the economic and religious heart of the New Kingdom Empire. To be the chief of its musical troupe was to be the chief executive of its entire sonic output. This woman would have been responsible for managing a large staff of singers and musicians, overseeing their training, ensuring the vast repertoire of hymns was perfectly preserved, and coordinating their performances for every major state ritual and daily liturgy. She was a manager, a quality control expert, and a spiritual leader all in one. The fact that this immense responsibility was consistently entrusted to women tells us that their voices were not just considered acceptable for divine service, but were in many contexts seen as the superior, preferred instrument for communicating with the gods. This suggests a theological dimension to their prominence. The perfect, harmonious voice needed to nourish the gods and maintain Ma'at was culturally associated with feminine qualities, and not as a sign of softness, but as a source of potent, life-giving, and ordering power. The most powerful gods had fierce, protective female counterparts Sekhmet for Ptah, Mut for Ammon, and the female voice was perhaps seen as the natural conduit for channeling this balancing, formidable feminine divine energy into the world. To understand just how high a temple singer could climb, we need only look at the lives of specific, named women, whose legacies were carved in stone for eternity. Take a woman like Merit Ammon, who lived during the New Kingdom. Her tomb inscriptions reveal she held the title, Chantress of Ammon, and was also the chief of the harem of Ammon, another powerful priestly role for women. Her tomb is not a modest affair. It's a lavish, decorated monument showing her in the finest linen and jewelry, receiving offerings, and presiding over rituals. This wasn't just a reflection of her family's wealth. It was a declaration of her own personal achievement and status, earned through her sacred office. Even more telling are the royal connections. Princess Meritaten, a daughter of the famous, heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, is depicted in art as a singer and musician, participating in the new worship of the sun disk, the Aten. While this was a break from tradition, it shows that even during a religious revolution, the role of royal women as sacred vocalists was so fundamental it was retained. Perhaps the most powerful example comes from later, during the Third Intermediate Period, with a woman named Karamama, who held the title God's Wife of Ammon and Chief of the Musical Troupe. The God's Wife was arguably the most powerful woman in Egypt after the queen herself, a celibate priestess who acted as the divine consort of the god Ammon. That this same woman also held the top musical position illustrates that musical mastery was considered an essential, inseparable part of the highest female religious authority. These women were not silent, secluded figures. Their statues show them holding the sistrum and menat, their bodies frozen in the act of making sacred noise. They are depicted standing with the same confident posture as male officials, their titles listed with the same pride. Their prominence in art and inscriptions demonstrates that their power was not a hidden, behind-the-scenes influence. It was a publicly celebrated and institutionally sanctioned form of authority. where their voice literally gave them a seat at the table in the most important rituals of the state. This unique position allowed elite women to navigate Egyptian society with a degree of financial and social autonomy that was extraordinary in the ancient world. As we discussed, their compensation in offering shares, land, and servants made them independently wealthy. A chantress did not need to rely solely on her father or husband for her economic survival. Her profession provided for her directly. Legal documents from the workmen's village of Deir el-Medina show women who were chantresses actively engaging in business, lending grain, buying and selling goods, and initiating lawsuits, all signs of legal personhood and economic agency. They could own property in their own name and bequeath it to their heirs. This financial independence was a direct result of their sacred office. Furthermore, the social network they built was immense. Serving in the temple brought them into daily contact with the highest officials in the land, the high priests, the viziers, and the royal family itself. Their position gave them access to the innermost circles of power. A chief of the musical troupe would have been a familiar and respected figure in the royal court, her opinions on ritual matters carrying significant weight. This created a powerful feedback loop. A woman from a noble family would be appointed as a singer, elevating her family's status. She would then use her wealth and connections to further her family's influence, and in turn, her daughter would be almost guaranteed a position, perpetuating the dynasty's hold on this sacred office for generations. This wasn't just a job, it was a strategic family enterprise. The tombs of these women are often found clustered together, showing how these powerful priestly and musical families intermarried and consolidated their power over centuries. By controlling the soundscape of the gods, they secured a dominant place in the social and political landscape of Egypt, proving that in a civilization built on the power of the spoken word, the woman whose voice was deemed fit for the gods could command a respect and authority that few others could ever achieve. This path from a young initiate to a master vocalist was not a gentle apprenticeship. It was a stringent, lifelong immersion into a living library of sound, beginning almost as soon as a child could form words. For a young girl born into a family of chantresses, her destiny was not a matter of choice but a birthright and a profound obligation. Her training commenced not in a classroom, but in the intimate, echoing spaces of her own home, under the exacting supervision of her mother, aunts, or grandmothers who were already masters of the craft. This was the ultimate oral tradition, millennia of accumulated sonic wisdom passed directly from one generation to the next, with no room for written cheat sheets or personal interpretation. The first and most daunting task was the memorization of the sacred texts themselves, a vast, complex corpus of hymns, spells, and liturgies that could number in the hundreds. Each hymn was a unique magical formula, and its power was believed to reside in the flawless sequence of its sounds. A young apprentice would spend hours each day listening and repeating, her young mind conditioned to absorb the precise pronunciation of archaic words, the subtle rhythmic cadences, and the specific melodic contours that gave each piece its unique spiritual function. She wasn't just learning to sing, she was learning to operate a complex piece of divine machinery, where every syllable was a cog and every note a connecting wire. The training was relentless. A single hymn might be repeated hundreds of times until the teacher was satisfied that not a single consonant was softened, not a single vowel length was shortened. This was not about finding her own voice, it was about perfectly replicating the voices of her ancestors, becoming a flawless vessel for sounds that were considered to be the very language of the gods. The pressure was immense, as a mistake in practice was met not just with correction, but with the sobering reminder that such an error in the temple could have cosmic repercussions. This daily discipline forged a unique kind of memory, one that could hold thousands of lines of intricate text with the fidelity of a modern recording device, ensuring the sacred sonic blueprints were preserved with perfect integrity for future generations. Parallel to this intense vocal conditioning was the meticulous study of sacred instrumentation. The sistrum and the menat were not simple noisemakers a child could pick up and play. They were ritual tools with their own strict protocols that had to be mastered. The young apprentice learned that the way one held a sistrum was as significant as the sound it made. The grip had to be firm yet graceful. the wrist movement precise and controlled to produce the correct, shimmering rustle, a sound that was sharp and clear, not a chaotic clatter. She practiced the specific rhythmic patterns associated with different deities, a faster, more vigorous shake for invoking the fierce energy of Sekhmet, and a slower, more melodious rustle for appeasing the benevolent Hathor. The heavy Menet necklace taught its own physical lessons. She learned how to hold its counterpoise and shake the strands of beads to produce a deep, resonant clatter that was distinct from the sistrum's metallic tone. This was not just about rhythm, it was about learning to coordinate her voice with her instruments, creating a multi-layered sonic offering where her chant, the sistrum's shimmer, and the Menet's clack wove together into a single, potent tapestry of sound. The physicality of this training was demanding, building the muscle memory and coordination needed to perform complex rituals without a single moment of hesitation or clumsiness. But the education extended far beyond music and movement. A crucial, and often overlooked, part of her curriculum was the mastery of ritual purity laws. To stand before a god and produce these sacred frequencies, her entire being, body, clothing, and mind had to be in a state of perfect cleanliness, or wab. This concept went far beyond simple hygiene. It was a spiritual prerequisite. She learned the exacting procedures for purification, which waters from the sacred lake were to be used for washing, how to cleanse her mouth with natron salt to ensure her breath was pure, and which foods were forbidden before a ritual to avoid spiritual contamination. She was taught the intricate calendar of festivals and holy days, understanding which hymns were to be sung at which hour, and which rituals were required for which phase of the moon. This comprehensive education transformed her from a mere student into a living database of liturgical knowledge, a walking, breathing repository of everything required to maintain the delicate relationship between the human and divine worlds. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of this lifelong commitment was the psychological and spiritual conditioning required to wield such power responsibly. From her earliest lessons, the apprentice was taught that the goal was not personal expression or artistic fame. The ultimate objective was self-effacement, to become such a perfect conduit for the divine word that her own individual identity momentarily dissolved during the performance. This was the state of ritual possession, where the goddess herself was believed to speak through the singer's voice. To achieve this, she underwent training that honed her concentration to an incredible degree. She learned to block out all external distractions, the murmur of a crowd, the flicker of a torch, and focus entirely on the vibrational quality of the sound she was producing and the divine presence she was addressing. This required a profound understanding of the theology behind the hymns. She didn't just memorize words, she studied their hidden meanings, the symbolic identities of the gods, and the specific outcomes each hymn was designed to produce. She learned to channel her intent, to feel the protective energy flowing through her as she sang a shield hymn for the pharaoh, or to embody the nurturing warmth of a mother goddess during a fertility rite. This was the final and most difficult stage of mastery, uniting perfect technical skill with an unwavering spiritual focus. The day she was finally deemed ready to perform in the inner sanctum was not a graduation, but an inauguration into a lifetime of unimaginable pressure. It was the moment she transitioned from preserving the tradition to actively using it to hold back chaos, feed the gods, and protect the kingdom, her voice now fully recognized as one of the most vital instruments of the state. But how do we move from understanding their profound duties to actually hearing their echoes across the millennia? The silence left by their vanished songs is filled with a different kind of music, the quiet, persistent hum of archaeological discovery. It is through the tangible remnants they left behind that we can begin to reconstruct their world, finding their voices not in the air, but in the art, objects, and writings they deliberately placed in their tombs for eternity. Perhaps the most immediate and vivid windows into their lives are the breathtakingly detailed tomb paintings that cover the walls of their final resting places. These aren't just decorative scenes, they are meticulously curated snapshots of their identity and their most important work, a permanent resume carved in stone and pigment. In these vibrant tableaus, we see them in action. A singer named Murat, for instance, is forever captured in her tomb at Thebes, standing gracefully, her body angled in what is clearly a dance step. In one hand, she confidently holds a sistrum aloft, its looped frame and discs clear as day. In her other hand, she grasps a menet necklace, its heavy counterpoise visible. Her mouth is slightly open, a subtle but powerful indication that she is not just holding these instruments, but is in the midst of a performance, her voice flowing in harmony with their sacred sounds. These images are invaluable because they show us the complete picture, the integration of voice, movement, and instrumentation that was so essential to their magic. We see them not as solitary figures, but as part of ensembles, working alongside harpists and lute players, their roles clearly defined and honored. The very fact that they chose to be depicted this way, in their finest linen and most elaborate wigs, tells us that this was the core of their identity, the aspect of their lives they were most proud to carry into the afterlife. Beyond these stunning images, we have the incredible fortune of finding the actual, physical instruments they used, carefully placed in their graves to ensure they could continue their divine service forever. While wood and linen rarely survive 4,000 years, more durable materials do. In tombs across Egypt, archaeologists have uncovered sistrums crafted from faience, a glazed ceramic that shines with a brilliant turquoise or blue-green color, as well as ones made of bronze and even solid silver. Holding one of these in your hand today is an uncanny experience. You can feel the weight of it, trace the carved face of the goddess Hathor on the handle, and if you shake it gently, it produces the very same shimmering, metallic rustle that once filled the temples of Karnak and Luxor. This is the sound that was believed to appease goddesses and repel chaos, a sound we can still hear today. Similarly, menet necklaces have been found in great numbers, their intricate faience beads and heavy counterpoise plaques often deposited in burials. These weren't cheap trinkets, they were valuable, sacred objects, personal and powerful tools of the trade. Finding them in a tomb is the archaeological equivalent of a modern professional being buried with their stethoscope or their master key. It signifies that this was not just a job, but a fundamental part of who they were, an essential skill they needed for existence in the next world. These artifacts transform the temple singers from abstract concepts into real people. The worn handle of a sistrum suggests years of use. The specific choice of material, the costly silver versus the more common faience, speaks to the wealth and status of its owner. They are silent, yet they tell a thunderous story of daily ritual, of calloused hands and unwavering devotion. Perhaps the most direct connection to their voices comes from the fragile papyri and inscribed temple walls that have preserved the very words they sang. Imagine a scroll, carefully unrolled after centuries in the dark, revealing the elegant hieroglyphic text of a hymn to the god Osiris. This isn't just a historical document, it is the original sheet music for a performance that hasn't been heard in over 2,000 years. These texts often include not only the lyrics but also detailed rubrics, instructions for the singer written in red ink. A rubric might specify, to be chanted by the chantress of Ammon while shaking the sistrum at dawn, or spell for the protection of the sacred bark, to be sung in a high pitch. These are the stage directions for the cosmic drama. The Chester Beatty Papyrus in Dublin, for example, contains a beautiful collection of hymns dedicated to the god Ramesses Roman III, deified after his death. The lyrics praise him as one with the sun god, and we know from the context that these were performed by temple singers in his memorial temple. Reading these words, we can almost hear the cadence, the rise and fall of the melody they were meant to carry. When we pair these lyrics with the tomb paintings showing the performance and the actual instruments found in the graves, the three strands of evidence, visual, object-based, and textual, weave together into a rich and resonant chord. We move from knowing about them to, in a very real sense, witnessing their work, and sometimes archaeology gives us a gift so specific it takes our breath away, a named individual with a face, a home, and a story. This is precisely what we find in the workmen's village of Deir el-Medina, the home of the artisans who built and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. This community was a hub of literacy and skill, and among its residents was a temple singer named Merit. Her small but beautifully decorated tomb provides an incredibly intimate portrait of a working singer's life. The walls show Merit not as a distant, idealized figure, but as a real woman engaged in her daily life and her sacred profession. In one scene, she sits with her husband, the scribe Ka, sharing a tender moment. In another, she is depicted in the afterlife, vibrantly alive, playing a game of Senate. But most importantly, we see her in her professional role. She is shown making offerings to the gods, and crucially, she is named with the title Chantress. What makes Merit's story so compelling is that her tomb was found intact, one of the rare, unlooted burials that provides a perfect time capsule. Among her grave goods were her personal belongings, cosmetic jars, furniture, and clothing. While her specific instruments may not have been listed separately, the context of her life in a village dedicated to the most sacred art of tomb building confirms her integral role in the spiritual life of her community. She wasn't a royal singer in a far-off capital. She was the local vocal technician, ensuring the protection and favor of the gods for the men who carved eternity into the rock. Her existence proves that this profession was not confined to the elite circles of Thebes, but was woven into the fabric of Egyptian society at many levels. Through Merit, the abstract concept of the temple singer gains a heartbeat. We see a person who loved, played, worked, and used her gifted voice to serve the divine, leaving behind a legacy that we can still touch and see today, a quiet testament to the power she once held in her breath. Walking through the hushed galleries of a modern museum, you might pause before a statue of a serene Egyptian woman, her hands gracefully holding a sistrum and menet. Or perhaps you'd see her likeness painted on a tomb wall, surrounded by hieroglyphs that curve and dance around her. To the untrained eye, these inscriptions are simply decorative script. But if you know how to listen, these carved words are actually the frozen echoes of a temple singer's voice, a permanent record of her resume, her rank, and her sacred responsibility. The Egyptians were meticulous record keepers, especially when it came to their eternal identities in the afterlife. For a temple singer, the titles inscribed beside her image were not just labels. They were a carefully curated declaration of her life's work, her spiritual authority, and her place in the divine mechanism of the state. Each title was a specific key that unlocked a different level of access, a different set of duties, and a different measure of honor. Decoding these titles is like finding an ancient organizational chart, revealing a hidden hierarchy of sound where every voice had its designated purpose and power. The most common title we encounter is the straightforward Singer of God's Name, such as Singer of Ammon, Singer of Hathor, or Singer of Montu. This seems simple on the surface, but its meaning is profound. It didn't just mean she performed music in a temple dedicated to that deity. In the Egyptian worldview, to be a Singer of Ammon was to be an official, state-appointed technician whose voice was a dedicated tool for that specific god's sustenance. It signified that she was part of the Hemu Netjer, the servants of the god, and that her vocal offerings were a non-negotiable part of that deity's daily ritual. This title also indicated specialization. A singer of Hathor would have mastered a very different repertoire and set of vocal techniques than a singer of Sekhmet. Her hymns to Hathor would be fluid, joyful, and focused on invoking love, music, and fertility, likely using more melodic and soothing tones. In contrast, a singer of Sekhmet would be trained in more forceful, aggressive chants designed to channel the goddess's destructive power against the enemies of Egypt or to cauterize spiritual sickness. The title tells us not just where she worked, but what kind of sonic magic she was trained to perform. It was a public badge of her expertise, telling everyone who saw her tomb that she possessed the specialized knowledge to correctly interact with a particular, powerful divine force. But within this broad category, there were clear ranks, and the Egyptians had specific titles to mark them. A higher-ranking singer often bore the title Chief of the Singers or Overseer of the musical troupe. This was a managerial and directorial role. This woman was not just a performer. She was a master teacher and a quality control supervisor. Her responsibilities would have been immense. She would have been tasked with training new initiates, ensuring the vast library of hymns was perfectly memorized by the entire choir, and coordinating the complex musical schedules for daily rites, lunar festivals, and major state celebrations. In a large temple like Karnak, which functioned like a small city, this was a significant administrative post. She would have managed the distribution of the offering shares to the other singers, maintained the temple's collection of sacred instruments, and reported directly to the high priest. Her title, carved on her statue, was a declaration of her executive authority within the temple's bureaucracy. It said she was trusted not only with the perfection of her own voice, but with the perfection of every voice under her command. For the state, ensuring this role was filled by a capable and loyal individual was critical, as a flaw in the temple's sonic output under her watch could have been deemed a national security risk. Some of the most evocative titles move beyond describing a job and instead describe a magical function, giving us a direct window into how the Egyptians perceived the singer's power. A title like "She Who Pacifies the God" is breathtakingly specific. This wasn't just a poetic flourish, it was a precise job description for a high-level form of spiritual diplomacy. We know from mythology that certain gods, particularly goddesses like Hathor in her form as the Eye of Ra, could be volatile and wrathful. The title, "She Who Pacifies the God," almost certainly refers to a singer specially trained to perform the rituals and songs designed to soothe the deity's anger and prevent them from unleashing their chaos upon the world. Her voice, combined with the shaking of the sistrum, was considered the primary tool for this appeasement. When she sang, she wasn't just asking for mercy. She was actively using the vibrational quality of her chant to calm the divine fury, to pacify it in a very real, magical sense. Another powerful title was Hand of the God. This suggests an even more intimate and direct form of channeling. While the voice was the primary instrument, this title implies a role in the physical rituals, perhaps anointing the statue or presenting offerings, all while her voice maintained the necessary sacred frequency. She was the literal instrument of the god's will, her hands and her voice working in unison to manifest divine power in the earthly realm. These functional titles reveal that the Egyptians saw their singers not as passive celebrants, but as active operators in a dynamic relationship with the divine, where a correctly titled individual could literally change a god's mood and alter the fate of the kingdom. For the women who held these positions, these carved titles were their claim to immortality. In a society obsessed with the afterlife, your tomb inscription was your permanent identity for eternity. A woman who chose to have "Chief of the Singers of Ammon" etched into the stone of her sarcophagus or the wall of her tomb was making a definitive statement. She was asserting that this role was the core of her being, the achievement for which she wished to be remembered forever. It guaranteed that in the afterlife, the gods would recognize her profession and her authority, allowing her to continue her sacred duties alongside Osiris in the field of reeds. This was deeply personal. By studying the progression of titles in a single tomb, sometimes from a simple singer to an overseer over the course of a career, we can trace an individual's professional ascent. We can see the pride in a title like Singer of the Interior, which likely denoted a singer with high security clearance, permitted to perform in the most restricted inner sanctuaries of the temple. This was the highest mark of trust and skill. These inscriptions were also legal and social documents. They anchored her family's status for generations. A daughter could point to her mother's tomb and her impressive list of titles as proof of their lineage's elite position and their rightful claim to similar roles. The stone, therefore, did more than just record a name and a job. It cemented a legacy, ensuring that the prestige and power she wielded in life would resonate through her descendants and echo through eternity, a perpetual testimony to the woman whose voice was once essential to the balance of the world. The first hint of her day was not light, but sound, the soft, insistent splash of sacred water as she washed away the impurities of sleep. While the sky over Thebes was still a deep, star-dusted indigo, the temple singer Maris Emun was already awake, performing the first and most crucial task of her day, ritual purification. In the dim light of her lamp, she would carefully cleanse her body with water drawn from the temple's sacred lake, a ritual known as wab, meaning to be pure. This was not a casual washing, it was a spiritual scrubbing, a necessary step to transform her from an ordinary woman into a pristine vessel fit to stand before a god. She would then cleanse her mouth with a pellet of natron salt, ensuring that the very breath she would use to form the sacred hymns was as clean and holy as the incense soon to be burned in the inner sanctum. Dressing in a freshly laundered robe of the finest white linen, she was now ready. Her day was a meticulously orchestrated symphony of devotion, where every note, every step, and every moment was dedicated to maintaining the delicate balance of the cosmos. Her first and most solemn performance began in the profound darkness of the naos, the windowless inner chamber that housed the statue of the god Amun. As the first sliver of Ra's sun breached the horizon, she would stand before the sealed doors of the shrine, her heart pounding not with fear, but with focused intensity. With the high priest performing the physical, opening of the mouth ceremony to reanimate the statue, her role was to provide the vibrational life. As the doors swung open to reveal the god in his knight-like state, she would raise her voice in the powerful, awakening hymn. This was no gentle lullaby, it was a commanding invocation, a vocal key designed to reignite the divine spark within the statue. The lyrics were assertive declarations. "Awake in peace, great Amun. You who fashioned yourself from the primordial waters, illuminate the two lands with your presence." Each perfectly pitched note, each correctly enunciated syllable, was believed to physically stir the god's ka, his life force, coaxing his conscious essence back into the world for another day. The success of this single performance set the tone for all that followed. A flawed hymn risked a lethargic, inattentive deity, while a perfect one ensured a god fully present and ready to receive the day's offerings and uphold Mat. With the god successfully awakened and nourished by the accompanying offerings of food, drink, and incense, the pace of her day would shift, though its sacred nature never diminished. The late morning often brought her to the temple's sun-drenched courtyard or a public hall for a very different kind of ceremony. Here, she was part of a larger ensemble, her voice joining a choir of other chantresses and the melodies of harps and lutes. This was where her role intersected directly with the people and the state. She might be performing a celebratory hymn during a public festival, her songs weaving a narrative of the pharaoh's divine right to rule, reinforcing his authority in the minds of the gathered crowds. Or she could be conducting a specialized ritual for a private patron, a wealthy noble who had paid the temple for a personalized ceremony. For this individual, she might sing a healing chant, her voice directed not at a grand cosmic force, but at the specific ailment afflicting the patron's body, using the vibrations of her song to drive out the spiritual cause of a fever or a persistent pain. This blend of the grandly political and the intimately personal showcased the versatility of her sacred office. The afternoon light often found her transitioning from her ceremonial duties to the surprisingly mundane administrative tasks that supported the temple's vast economy. This was the other, often overlooked, half of her life. As a woman of high status, she might retreat to a temple office to consult with scribes, reviewing the inventory of offering goods or overseeing the distribution of rations to the lower-ranking temple staff. Her own substantial payment came in the form of these very offerings: prime cuts of meat, loaves of fine bread, jugs of beer, and bolts of high-quality linen. Managing this wealth was a responsibility in itself. She might need to authorize the trade of surplus linen for other goods or discuss the management of the agricultural estate granted to her by the temple, ensuring its fields produced enough grain to support her household. This seamless shift from channeling divine energy to discussing crop yields highlights a fundamental truth about the temple singer. She was not an isolated mystic, but a fully integrated member of a complex, bureaucratic institution. Her spiritual authority was underpinned by tangible economic power, and both required her diligent attention. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the hypostyle hall, her final major duty commenced: the evening rites. These were a mirror of the morning ritual, but with a different emotional tone. The goal was no longer to awaken, but to soothe and protect. The hymns sung at dusk were often focused on ensuring the god's safe journey through the perils of the night, a voyage that mirrored the sun god Ra's struggle against the serpent Apep in the underworld. Her voice, perhaps accompanied by the gentle, rhythmic rustle of her sistrum, created a cocoon of harmonious sound around the temple, a protective barrier against the chaotic forces that grew stronger in the darkness. She was, in effect, singing the god to sleep, ensuring his sanctuary remained holy and his essence secure until the cycle began anew at dawn. Finally, as true darkness fell and the temple quieted, she would undergo one last purification, washing away the sacred residues of the day before returning to her home and her family. Stepping out of the temple precinct, she would shed her role as a conduit for the divine and become, for a few precious hours, simply Marisemun. Yet even in her rest, the echoes of the day's hymns likely lingered in her mind, a constant, low hum of devotion, a reminder that when the stars next began to fade, she would once again pick up her sistrum, take a purified breath, and resume her vital work of holding the universe in balance, one perfect note at a time. Yet for all its power and prestige, this sacred profession was not destined to last forever. The world outside the temple walls was shifting, and the unique, multifaceted role of the temple singer, so deeply embedded in the theology of the Egyptian state, began a slow but irreversible decline. The first cracks in this ancient institution appeared not with a sudden invasion, but with a revolution from within. During the reign of the pharaoh Akhenaten in the 14th century before the Common Era, the entire religious framework of Egypt was turned upside down. Akhenaten rejected the entire pantheon of gods, from Ammon to Osiris, and declared that there was only one supreme deity, the Aten, the physical sun disk. This wasn't just a theological adjustment, it was a systematic dismantling of the entire temple economy and its personnel. The great state temples were closed, their revenues seized, and their rituals abandoned. For the temple singers, this was an existential crisis. Their entire purpose, their meticulously crafted hymns to a multitude of deities, their specialized knowledge of each god's preferences and personalities, was rendered obsolete overnight. Their voices, once the key to cosmic balance, were now silenced by royal decree. While some royal women, like Akhenaten's daughters, are depicted as singers in the new worship of the Aten, the role was fundamentally altered. The intimate, magical connection between a specific hymn and a specific god's essence was gone, replaced by a more generalized praise of a distant, impersonal force. The deep, esoteric knowledge of the singers was no longer relevant. Though the traditional religion was restored after Akhenaten's death, the event proved that the entire system was vulnerable. It showed that the authority of the singer was not inherent, but was dependent on the stability and theological consistency of the state that employed them. The priesthoods, especially the powerful priests of Ammon, regained their power and the singers returned to their duties, but the unthinkable had now been thought. The foundation had been shaken. A much slower, but ultimately more relentless, pressure came from the increasing foreign influence on Egypt over the following centuries. As the empire contracted and foreign powers like the Libyans, Nubians, and later the Persians began to rule Egypt, the nature of kingship itself changed. These foreign pharaohs often lacked the deep, innate connection to the god Horus that was central to the traditional theology. They might pay lip service to the Egyptian gods to legitimize their rule, but their personal beliefs and the cultural influences they brought with them began to dilute the pure stream of Egyptian religious practice. The temple singers, whose primary political function was to magically protect the Egyptian pharaoh as the embodiment of Maat, now found themselves serving rulers who were, in the eyes of many, outsiders. The potency of their rituals, which relied on a shared, unshakable belief in the pharaoh's divinity, was inevitably weakened. Furthermore, these new rulers often appointed their own relatives or loyalists to high priestly positions, disrupting the ancient, inherited lineages of the Egyptian elite. The cherished position of Chantress of Ammon, once the exclusive domain of the most powerful native Egyptian families, could now be given to the daughter of a Libyan chieftain or a Persian noble. While these women may have performed the rituals, the deep, generational understanding of the hidden meanings in the hymns, the subtle vocal techniques passed from mother to daughter for 1,000 years, began to fade. The role risked becoming a hollow ceremonial shell, its magical heart slowly ceasing to beat. The singers were still there, but the world that gave their songs ultimate meaning was slowly disappearing around them. The final, decisive blow came with the arrival of the Greeks and then the Romans. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 before the Common Era, he was proclaimed pharaoh, and his general, Ptolemy, founded a dynasty that would rule for 300 years. The Ptolemies were pragmatic. They built magnificent new temples in the Egyptian style and supported the priesthoods, but their worldview was fundamentally Greek. They syncretized Egyptian gods with their own, creating hybrid deities like Serapis. But this blending of traditions further eroded the unique, precise nature of Egyptian ritual. A hymn sung to a syncretized god lacked the specific, targeted power of a hymn to Ammon or Hathor. The magic of Heka was rooted in the exact replication of primordial sounds and names. Changing those names, or merging them with foreign equivalents, broke the magical circuit. The temple singers now performed in a cultural landscape that was increasingly bilingual and cosmopolitan. The royal court spoke Greek, and the center of power shifted to the new, gleaming city of Alexandria, a hub of Greek philosophy and science where the intricate magic of the Egyptian temples was seen as a curious antiquity rather than a vital technology. The singers were becoming museum pieces, preserving a tradition that was losing its relevance to the rulers of the country. Then came the Romans, and with them, a final, administrative and spiritual suffocation. After the defeat of Cleopatra VII and Mark Antony, Egypt became a Roman province, the personal breadbasket of the Roman emperor. The Romans were brilliant administrators and saw the vast temple estates, with their immense wealth and large staffs, including the singers, as a potential source of power and revenue that needed to be controlled. They systematically brought the temples under state regulation, appointing the high priests themselves and siphoning off temple revenues to feed Rome and its armies. The economic model that had supported the temple singers for millennia, the redistribution of divine offerings, was severely compromised. With fewer resources, the great musical troupes likely shrank. The rigorous, lifelong training of new chantresses became a luxury that fewer families could afford or that the temples could no longer fully fund. But the most profound change was spiritual. The Roman world was a marketplace of ideas, with new philosophies and mystery cults gaining popularity. The ancient Egyptian notion that a perfectly sung hymn could physically affect the universe was fundamentally at odds with the more secular, bureaucratic Roman mindset and the emerging intellectual currents of the time. The unique job description of the temple singer, a blend of priest, magician, and civil servant, had no place in the Roman imperial system. Their authority evaporated because the cosmology that granted them that authority was no longer the dominant belief of the ruling class. They were now merely musicians in a state-controlled religious institution, their magical duties rendered obsolete by a new world order. The final echoes of their songs were silenced by the rise of Christianity. As the new faith spread across the Roman Empire, it specifically targeted and rejected the very principles that were the lifeblood of the temple singer. The Christian doctrine condemned the worship of idols, directly challenging the core ritual of awakening and feeding the divine statue. It renounced magic and the power of spoken spells, labeling the ancient practice of Heka as demonic sorcery. And it preached a single, transcendent God who could not be manipulated by ritual, but could only be approached through faith and prayer. In this new theological landscape, the temple singer's entire skill set was not just irrelevant, it was heretical. The great temples were closed by imperial decree in the 4th century of the Common Era, their statues defaced, their altars smashed. The last generation of chantresses saw the end of their world. The sacred instruments, the sistrums and menats, were discarded or melted down. The vast libraries of hymns, the accumulated sonic wisdom of 3,000 years, were left to crumble into dust in abandoned temple storerooms or were burned as pagan texts. Without a temple, without a god to serve, and without a society that believed in their power, the role vanished completely. The real job of the temple singer, a vocation that had sustained the cosmos and defined the lives of countless women for millennia, could not survive the death of the belief system that created it. Their story is a powerful reminder that even the most sacred and enduring traditions are intimately tied to the world they inhabit. And when that world transforms beyond recognition, the most beautiful and powerful songs can, in the end, fall silent. When Hollywood paints a picture of ancient Egypt, it often gives us a very specific and tantalizing image of its musicians. We see them as sensual dancers writhing in smoky banquet halls, or as alluring background figures providing a sonic backdrop for romance and intrigue. These characters are often depicted as possessing a raw, untamed talent, their music meant to stir the passions of a pharaoh or a wealthy noble. It's a compelling and dramatic vision, but it is a fiction that completely misses the profound reality of the temple singer's true station. The real women who held these titles were not entertainers for the elite, they were the religious elite themselves. Their stage was not a palace party, but the most sacred chamber in the temple. Their audience was not a mortal king, but the god of the universe. To mistake them for mere performers is to fundamentally misunderstand the structure of Egyptian society and the nature of their sacred office. The Hollywood version is about personal allure and earthly pleasure. The historical reality was about cosmic responsibility and spiritual power. The fictional dancer might be admired for her beauty. The real chantress was respected for her authority, her education, and her indispensable role in keeping the world from falling into chaos. Consider the difference in their qualifications. A film might show a girl plucked from the streets for her natural grace or her haunting voice. In reality, a temple singer was almost always born into her position. She came from a powerful, aristocratic family, and her appointment was a carefully managed affair of state, akin to a modern diplomat or a Supreme Court justice taking their seat. Her training began in early childhood, a rigorous academic and spiritual boot camp. She wasn't just learning melodies. She was memorizing hundreds of complex hymns in an archaic, formal dialect of Egyptian, mastering the precise pronunciation of every syllable to ensure the magical efficacy of the ritual. She studied the complex principles of Heka, the theology of the gods, and the intricate calendar of festivals. This was not a casual education. It was a lifetime of disciplined study to become a living repository of sacred knowledge. Her value lay not in her spontaneity or her personal charm, but in her flawless ability to replicate sounds and rituals that were thousands of years old. A single misstep in her performance wasn't an artistic blunder. It was a ritual failure that could, in the Egyptian worldview, have dire consequences for the entire nation. This was not a role for a free-spirited artist. It was a role for a scholarly, dedicated, and highly trained theological technician. The contrast in their daily lives is equally striking. The cinematic version is one of leisure and pleasure, performing at will in luxurious surroundings. The real temple singer's life was governed by a strict, unyielding schedule of purifications and rituals. Her day started before dawn with a ceremonial washing in sacred water, cleansing her body and her mouth to become a pure vessel for the divine. She then proceeded into the windowless, incense-filled darkness of the inner sanctum to perform her most critical duty, awakening the god. There was no audience for this performance, no applause. It was a solitary, high-pressure act of vocal magic, where her song was believed to literally stir the deity's life force back into its statue. Her music wasn't designed to be emotionally stirring in a human sense. It was designed to be cosmically effective. Throughout the day, she might shift to other duties, singing protective hymns for the pharaoh's safety, performing healing chants for a sick patron, or leading a public festival to reinforce state ideology. Every action was purposeful, every note intentional. Her life was one of immense discipline and sacred duty, a world away from the frivolous and sensual existence portrayed on the silver screen. Perhaps the most damaging misconception is the source of their power. In films, a musician's influence is often depicted as stemming from her personal relationship with a powerful man, a pharaoh she can enchant with her song. This reduces her to a dependent figure, whose power is derivative and precarious. The true power of the historical temple singer was institutional and divine. Her authority came from her office, her impeccable lineage, and her mastery of Heka. She didn't need to enchant a pharaoh. Her rituals were what protected and legitimized the pharaoh. She was a key part of the spiritual infrastructure of the state. Her wealth came not from royal gifts given on a whim, but from her formal salary of sanctified offerings, prime cuts of meat, fine linens, and beer, which she received as a right of her position. This economic independence allowed her to own land, manage estates, and build a legacy that she could pass to her daughters. She was a public figure of immense status, depicted in statues and tomb paintings alongside the highest officials in the land. Her power was her own, rooted in a system that recognized her voice as one of the most vital instruments of governance and cosmic maintenance. The real job of the temple singer was, therefore, one of the most serious and respected professions in all of ancient Egypt. It was a role that combined the intellect of a scholar, the discipline of a priest, the skill of a virtuoso, and the responsibility of a national security official. To see her as anything less is to ignore the profound evidence she left behind and to silence the powerful echo of her true, world-sustaining song. As we reach the end of our journey, the portrait that emerges is of a role so complex and vital that our modern label of singer feels woefully inadequate. The temple singer was, in reality, a master of sacred sound, a title that barely scratches the surface of her true duties. She was a magician, a priestess, a healer, a political strategist, and a cosmic engineer, all woven into one. Her voice was not merely an instrument of beauty, but a precision tool for maintaining reality itself, a technology of the spirit that was as essential to Egypt's survival as the Nile's annual flood. From the hushed darkness of the inner sanctum to the sun-drenched public courtyards, her work formed the constant, harmonic hum that underpinned civilization, a sonic thread stitching together the human and the divine. To summarize, her real job is to compile a list of responsibilities that would daunt even the most capable individual. As a master of sacred sound, she was the ultimate technician, her vocal cords calibrated through years of brutal training to produce the exact frequencies believed to nourish the gods and repel chaos. Every note was a calculated emission of energy, every perfectly pronounced syllable a key in a divine lock. As a magician, she was a practitioner of Heka, wielding the creative power of the spoken word to manifest protection for the pharaoh, healing for the sick, and victory for the sun god in his nightly battle against the serpent Apep. Her song was an event, not a performance. It actively shaped the world. As a political influencer, her voice was a tool of statecraft, broadcasting the divine legitimacy of the king and reinforcing the social order through public hymns that were as much about control as they were about devotion. And as a key pillar of Egyptian society, she was an economic force, a landowner, and a public figure of immense status, whose office provided her with a rare degree of independence and influence that shaped her family's legacy for generations. This multifaceted role challenges our modern compartmentalization of careers. We tend to separate the artist from the scientist, the religious figure from the political operator. The temple singer dissolves all those boundaries. Her art was her science, her faith was her politics, and her spiritual practice was her practical contribution to national security. She existed in a world where sound was substance and melody was a tangible force, and her unique position allowed her to navigate the highest echelons of power while performing the most intimate acts of spiritual care. From awakening a deity at dawn to driving a demon of disease from a sick child, her scope of influence was truly universal. So, the next time you hear a beautiful song, one that sends a shiver down your spine or fills you with a sense of profound peace, remember that in ancient Egypt, such a voice could wake a god, protect a king, and hold the very universe together. It's a perspective that forever changes how we listen, reminding us of the immense, forgotten power that can reside in the human voice. We've covered an incredible amount of ground, from the secret meanings hidden in hymn lyrics to the political power of a chantress of Ammon. Now, we'd love to hear from you. Which part of the temple singer's real job surprised you the most? Was it the idea that they were essentially cosmic technicians, or the fact that they were some of the most powerful and independent women in the ancient world? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.